David Giffels is well known to students at the University of Akron as an associate professor of English. But if you have been reading the New York Times lately, you may know him by a more illustrious title, the Bard of Akron, as he was dubbed by literary critic Samuel G. Friedman. Whereas the epic poet Homer sang of Troy and Virgil of Rome, Giffels has been chanting the tragic comic song of Akron, his hometown, for most of his career. Formerly an award-winning columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal, he has chronicled everything from the city's abandoned rubber factories to the colossal amounts of cheese heaped on the salads at Luigi's restaurant. Giffels explored the treasures and secrets of the city and of his life in his critically acclaimed books, All the Way Home, Building a Family in a Falling Down House, and Hard Way on Purpose, Essays and Dispatches from the Rust Belt. Earlier this month, he published what is perhaps his most profound work to date, Furnishing Eternity, A Father, a Son, a Coffin, and a Measure of Life, which is a poignant meditation on aging and mortality, friendship, and the bond of a father and son. In the memoir, Giffels enlists his 81-year-old father, a retired engineer and expert woodworker, to help him construct, of all things, his own coffin. Despite its thematic heaviness, the project began as a kind of light-hearted experiment, springing from a playful argument between Giffels and his wife, Gina. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You told your wife, quite adamantly, that you wanted to be buried in a cardboard box.
I did.
Why?
We have this sort of quasi-argument that she has a very formal, old country tradition of funerals in her Sicilian family, and so believes that you have to buy an expensive factory-built casket and spend all of the money on the commercial part of a funeral. And I have this very cavalier idea that my body is worth nothing and can be thrown into the woods when I die or whatever. And so I struck upon this idea, which was semi-realistic, that I could be buried in a cardboard box, because I had seen a cardboard casket in a funeral home, which turned out not to really be a realistic thing. But it just kind of started that ball rolling that because she wanted something very formal, I was driven to want something very non-traditional, which somehow led to a conversation between me and my dad, who's a fine woodworker, that we could build a casket ourselves. And it was more or less just something I said out loud and was kind of hanging in the air long enough that it started to be an idea and took hold.
It got serious, though, quickly, did it not?
It did, yeah. So we actually decided this would be kind of a cool thing to do. My dad was very happy-go-lucky and would roll with anything that his kids threw at him. So we actually decided it'd be kind of a neat project to do. And really, it was much more, as he was getting into his 80s, a way for me to spend time with him.
Yeah.
It didn't really matter what we were building. It was just my favorite way to spend time with him was in his workshop, that was his sort of true environment. And so that's how it started. And very soon I thought this would be something I'd like to write about, and approaching middle age and thinking about the theme of mortality, it would be a way to sort of address that theme in what I thought would be a more theoretical, intellectual way. And within a year of us starting this, my mother died, and then a year later my best friend died. And so it was almost like the writing gods were saying, don't mess with Mother Nature. We're going to give you some really difficult ways to approach this theme that you thought you were playing around with.
The book, as the reader will quickly discover, is not so much about death as it is about life, and specifically about the one whom you call, quote, the most alive person that you have known, your father, Thomas. Sadly, he passed away earlier this month, and yet through this book, the light of his life still burns. Let's talk about your father. You say in the memoir that he was not the bestowing life wisdom kind of guy, but that you nonetheless learned so much from him, more than you could even quantify. What are some of the things you learned from your father?
Well, he wasn't the sort of like talky emo dad that I am with my kids. I mean, my kids can't stop me from giving them advice and sharing feelings and stuff. But he was sort of like German engineer background, not stiff, but also not one to be talking about his feels. But he loved to spend time with his kids and loved to do projects with us. And especially with this project, there were two things I learned from him. One was because I lost my mother, he lost his wife simultaneously. was his sense of humor never flagged. And I was obsessed with grief after my mom died, and he was grieving too, but he was finding this optimism, this way of kind of taking charge of what life he had left. I mean, his mortality was much more challenged by the death of his wife than mine was, because they had spent 50 years together. He's 80 years old, and suddenly he's a widow. And instead of wallowing that, he just embraced every day, and not in a like I'm getting up and embracing the day way, but just sort of got up and by example got up and did it. And the other thing I learned from him, I think, that I was very aware of was a kind of patience that he has. My dad was a very, like, we jokingly called him Antsy Pants, because he was like, whenever we would go somewhere, he's like, let's go, come on, it's time to go. And he seemed very impatient. But in this woodworking project, I would be like, let's get through this drudgery of sanding, or just, some of the parts of it weren't fun. And he's just very detail-oriented, very, sort of gracious about the process, which was a great lesson for me as a writer. Not that he would have thought that, but to remember that the parts of it that aren't fun require just as much of you as the parts of it that you love doing the most. And so, just that process, and writing while I was working on this woodworking project with him was a really instructive thing for me that he gave me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about how this experience might have shaped you as a writer and as a teacher especially. You consider your father a teacher, and I think it's no coincidence that you yourself are a professional teacher. How has this experience influenced you or informed you, even in the classroom, maybe how you interact with students?
I've been thinking about this since this semester started, because my dad, he was a good teacher even though he didn't overtly teach. He didn't say, son, here's a lesson. But the one thing that he embodied that I always try to remember, and he's helped me remember, since we went through this process, is that teaching requires humility. Even though it seems like you are the center of attention in the classroom and that somehow you have something more than they have, it really requires listening and empathy, like thinking of what they need from you. And my dad was very aware in this process of where my weaknesses were as a woodworker. And so, like, for instance, with the router, this one tool that has always kind of like befuddled me, and in fact I get kind of badly injured with it early in the process in the book, he would continually recognize that I needed to be in control of the router up to the level of danger, and then with him, like, just there. But he gave me as much leeway as he could, and just that little lesson has kind of recurred to me a few times in the classroom. It's like, how much do I need to give this person, and how much do I need to let them kind of take it from there? And it's so individual, especially in a writing classroom where everyone's skill levels and ambitions are different, that you have to kind of adjust with each of them.
What you said about the router reminded me of a great scene from the book, where you cut yourself with the router and you bleed into the wood.
Yes.
You feel like you've now ensouled the wood, because you were really upset that you had to go buy this really impersonal wood from Home Depot with the barcodes on it, this soulless wood, and then you cut yourself and the blood bleeds into it. But to get back to teaching, what is it that you most enjoy about being a teacher?
The thing I most enjoy about being a teacher, especially as somebody who's always loved writing and reading, is that I get to be in a room full of people who like writing and reading and talk about books and literature. I mean, it's to be around a community of writers, which is what I'm around, both with my graduate students and undergraduate students. And they recognize that community too. They aren't individuals who want to be writers. They're people who recognize themselves as part of a community, and I feel sort of blessed to be part of that community.
You write creative nonfiction, and you teach creative nonfiction. In fact, you are the campus director of the Northeast Ohio Master of the Fine Arts program here at the university. Why creative nonfiction? Why not just fiction or poetry?
I wrote fiction and poetry when I was an undergrad here. I got all three of my degrees are from the University of Akron. I'm a proud Zip. And early in my career, I thought I would be a fiction writer. And I mostly accidentally happened into journalism, and very soon came to love journalism and understand it. as it was teaching me a lot about writing that I wouldn't have learned if I had continued to write fiction. Mainly the idea that writing is not sitting in a room by yourself thinking awesome thoughts and putting them onto a piece of paper, but it's an engagement with the world, which as a very shy young person I had not done very much of. And journalism forced me to engage with the world and with other people, and to recognize that writing is really communication that requires some sort of interaction and understanding, and that whatever you're writing about is giving you something, you're not giving something to the world. And so, you know, I was a journalist for 18 years before I kind of turned to the kind of writing I've been doing for the past.
Can you talk a little bit about the role that writing played in grappling with your grief while writing this book? It's a kind of catharsis, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I started out thinking that I engaged in a writing project, like that I was in control. And first the death of my mother and then the death of my friend made me realize how foolish I was to think that you were ever in control of an idea, because the idea turned on me and kind of bit me in the butt and said, you need to work differently. And so it taught me, first of all, to recognize that the writer is not all-powerful. But also taught me, I mean, I had written about things as they were occurring. That's what a journalist does. But I had never written about something so raw and emotional as it was occurring. And so I had to write through a lot of, you know, grief is very chaotic and violent and changes day by day in ways that you don't expect. And so as I was kind of recording raw notes about what I was experiencing at that time, also taught me how valuable, you know, the rough parts of writing are. You know, I really like revising and finishing and sort of the fine-tuning parts of writing. And this kind of taught me about the value of that really super raw.
I seem to recall in my last interview with you that you have a very Workaday mentality to writing. Yeah. You kind of reject that romantic notion of the, you know, although you are the Bard of Akron, you know, you don't seem to write in these fits and raptures like some inspired prophet. You have a very, let's just say, you approach writing like a woodworker.
That's very true, and I think it comes very much from being the son of an engineer. And also, you know, the son of a Midwestern Rust Belt family. I mean, and also, you know, I played music when I was younger, and that sort of underground do-it-yourself aspect to, you know, it's fun to get on stage and jump around, but you have to post the flyers and book the shows and get in the van and go somewhere and carry your gear and all that stuff. Really taught me a lot of life lessons. And so, as fun as it is to write on a good writing day, it sucks to write on a bad writing day, but you have to get through the bad ones to get to the good ones. So yeah, so when I'm working on a project, I do work sort of banker's hours. I have one rule: my office is in my house, and it makes it very easy for, you know, the other parts of life to bleed into the workplace. So my one rule is when I go to work in the morning, I have to put on a pair of shoes. Because it's like you're going to work.
That's right.
Put some shoes on and get to work.
Just can't work with the shoes off.
No slippers or flip-flops.
You know, speaking of life lessons, you write toward the end of the book that wisdom is nothing more than a lifetime of mistakes made. Is there any piece of hard-won wisdom that you'd like to share?
I guess, you know, because I kept thinking that through writing this and through experiencing this kind of heavy losses, that I would sort of reach some sort of like epiphany or some sort of like a higher level of understanding. And what I really learned is that the closer you get to the end of life, either your own life or somebody else's life, the more true the very, very simple things become. And so there's a line in the book that starts out as kind of a silly cliche. My friend John says to me, life is short. And of course life is short, and it's about as cliche as it can get. But the closer he came to the end of his short life, he lived 48 years, the more that became true, and the more what he meant by that became true, which is like, don't take it for granted. Right. You know, and all of the things that sound like cliches until they hit that truth, and then they resonate in ways that they never resonated before.
Well, David, it was a pleasure to read your book, and it was an honor to speak with you today. And I thank you for taking the time to sit here, and I thank you for your candor. And I wish you the best of luck in all your future endeavors.
Thank you.
And I would like to just let the audience know that his book, Furnishing Eternity, is available in bookstores everywhere. It's on Amazon and also at the UA bookstore as well. Thank you, Dave.
All right, thank you.